Hello everyone, this is the second part of our second class of week 5. So previous video, if you didn't see, there's two for the Wednesday, Thursday class of week 5. There is a lighting specific camera setup video, and this is the second version of that, which is the render one. So we're gonna open up from where we left off. And I'm going to go through the render settings. So make sure you save your scene before you do this. So save copy plus save. And now we are going to really quick go to our output properties and drop your resolution down to 50%. So when you're more doing like working renders, it's helpful to drop your resolution because that's going to drop your render time. It's not in half, it's like double that in fourths, because the resolution is like both in X and Y. Oh, I did the opposite, X and Y. So it'd be 50% X, 50% Y, so it's dropping it down to a quarter of the amount of time it would take. So just helpful to make sure our render is aimed where we want it, everything's looking good before we have it full resolution. So to actually render, you can either hit F12 as the hotkey, or you can go up to render and render image. And how fast this takes is determined off mostly your system, your computer you're using. So if you have a little bit more advanced hardware than mine, yours will go faster. If you're on a laptop, it will most likely take a bit longer. So main point for this class is make sure you have enough time to do your final renders. So most of these projects are going to be due at the start of class, so make sure you're starting your render, like do a test render a few days before that, just so that you're not running up last minute and your render, if it turns out it takes a couple hours just because of the computer you're using, you don't want to just put yourself in that scenario where you're like waiting for your render to finish. So you can see my render, like it looks slightly better than this version, but it's not that good just because I put the resolution not in half. Well, it's at half, but yes, it is at half, but it took a quarter of the time than it would take if it's at 100%. But you can see with my render, I have like random objects in here. So if you see any of your hidden objects, we have to tell them to not show up in our render. So that's what these are, is I was like doing a pillow and then I decided I didn't like it, so I hid it. So if you just have like random things showing up, those are your hidden objects coming back to haunt us. So we're just going to change a setting for that really quick, which is going to be this like funnel. Oh, it's called a filter. So top right section of your screen, there's a little funnel icon. If you click on that, you can toggle some restrictions. So this eyeball is basically like hiding an object or not. The camera is going to be if it's visible in the render. So once we click that, if I do a render again, it's still going to show up those objects. We have to actually physically go in, find your closed eyeballed objects, and go in and click on the camera icon so it has an X on it. And now if you go in and do your render, so F12 or go up and do render and render image, and we shouldn't have creepy floating pillows. So this is what my final render will look like. This will give me a good gauge of if I have to move my camera around, and I mean I probably would reposition it just to like not clip my spoon, and I might look down a little bit more on my scene. But main part of this class is going to show you guys how to get rid of all these little dots. So you might notice, like, my candle is very dotty. I have random like fuzziness, like it looks blurry. So this is both because of the resolution and because of the samples that I mentioned last class. So let me actually change the slot. So every time you render, if you just keep it in the same slot, they're called slots, it's just going to re-render an image and get rid of the old one. If you want to do like compare contrast, you can change your slot before you render it, and then you can always go back and look at your previous render. So I'm going to do that just so we can like see the difference. Also, you can see the amount of time your render took. So mine only took 15 seconds. If I open a slot 2, put my resolution at 100%, you can technically even put this at 200%, and it's going to quadruple your render time. So if you want to do that to try to get rid of some of the graininess, you can, if your computer is a superhero, but don't feel pressured to do that if you're working on a laptop. So you can see this looks a lot better than our previous one. Let's do before, after. So resolution will have some effect over that graininess, but it will, like you can see, it took this one a full minute. That previous one was only 15 seconds. So it is going to increase your render time a lot. So we're going to do a few different strategies first before we do resolution. One of the main parts to alter this is, since these are from samples, we can increase the sample size. So if I go to my render properties, you can see there's a sampling section, and my render right now has 128 samples. So technically I could go in and increase this, but that's not going to be the most efficient, because if you look at my render, so if you want to just pull up your render without re-rendering, you can hit F11. So F12 is like new render, F11 is bring up the render I just did. You can see like my vase looks pretty nice. My spoon looks pretty nice. There's not too many like dots. It's mostly just in my candle and my glass. And that's because light rays, the samples is just following those light rays. And the light rays have to do more work because my candle wax has subsurface scattering and my glass has transmission. So I can actually alter those samples independently. If I increase my whole render samples, it's going to increase it for everything and just add unnecessary time to rendering the parts that already look fine. Look, it looks fine. So to give you some more specific control, you can open up your render properties, little Nikon camera or Sony. I'm not sponsored. And then under sampling, if you go to branched path tracing, it's going to open up all the like subsets of samples. So the parts that usually look good are your diffuse. The ones that might look bad might be glossy, so that's going to be like kind of like your highlights. Transmission, so anything with like glassy transmission effect. Ambient occlusion, I might have mentioned this before, it's kind of giving more shadows based off of how close in proximity. So if you're noticing like weird shadows between this cupcake, your ambient occlusion is probably fine. We'll just say that. And then subsurface is probably going to be the main one. Subsurface and transmission really are going to be the ones you have to change. And if I go from a transmission of 1 to 2, it's not like, it's not technically at like 129 now. If you go below all of these options, it's going to list how many samples is for each section. And these numbers are basically multipliers. So you're multiplying the amount of samples by 2 for transmission. So everything has 128, but now transmission has 256. So just keep that in mind. If you are like, wait, it needs to be really good, so let me put in 10. Now it has 1,280 samples, which is going to probably take like an hour for my computer for that, and maybe a full day for some of your guys. So try to do it in segments. I might go up to 3 and 3, just because I know my computer. You might want to do a little bit more gradually. But now, I want to make sure I open up a new slot first so we could do more compare contrasts. And now let me render. So F11 to bring up your past render, F12 to do a new render. And I'll cut out my render time so it's not like I instantly got a render. Okay, am I back? So you can see we're finishing up this render now, and it's at like the 8-minute mark. So technically, when I practiced this, it only took 2 minutes to do this render, but because I had my streaming software on for like recording the class, you can see it bumped it up to 8 minutes. So if your render time is really long, it's also going to be dependent on what software you're using on your computer in the background. So it's best to do this like when you don't have to use your computer for anything else, just so that your full computer power can go towards your rendering. But now we can see our compare contrast. So here's it where I didn't increase the samples for my subsurface scattering or my vase of the glass. Here is it, and you can see, oh, look at that. My candle looks so good now. It doesn't have any of those dots. So you can see the effect that it has for getting rid of the dots, the noise. There is one other strategy that might be more accessible for most of you. So again, render time is going to depend on what hardware you have, what you have to be working on your computer like while you're doing the renders. So if you don't have the time to have, you can see I just increased my transmission and my subsurface up to 3 if that was too much time for you. You can also try this other last resort to try to just cut down your render time as much as possible. You might have to do a combo of both just for your like very final render. So again, helpful to do test renders at 50% resolution. In that I can check out how everything's going. I can see that I have a few issues in my scene. You'll actually see it a little bit better in my bigger one. But when I'm grading, I'm going to be looking at like how realistic the scene is. So one issue right now is my vase is floating. So look where your objects are meeting the floor. So my vase is floating, my candlestick is floating a little bit. I probably wouldn't be too strict on, because that's not floating too much. That's pretty obvious. My bear looks fine except for his one footsie is cutting into that blanket. I think my vase is also cutting into the blanket. So make sure there's no visible cutting issues. I think technically my spoon is cutting into my vase, but I strategically can't see that, so I can't dock myself for it. But I'm going to be looking at where the objects meet each other, so it looks like it's like resting naturally on one another. So that's an issue you can see hopefully before your final render. So I'm going to show you guys how to use Blender's denoiser as a probably hopefully more accessible way to deal with these issues. And actually, before that, I do want to show one thing. So if you are experimenting with these samples, you do have the option to restrict your view a bit more. So instead of having to render your entire image, if I'm just trying to improve like this one part of my image, I can work with that so I have less render time. So to do that, if you hit Control B, you're going to get the little like dotted line scenario, and you can draw a little box, and it's only going to work with that space now. And then if you render it, it'll only render this square. So if you're just trying to get rid of the noise in this area, I recommend doing that just so it doesn't have to render that whole area. But then Control B, get that whole camera section selected again. So, where is it? We want to use our denoiser, which is a handy thing this version of Blender has, where it's going to look at where the dots are showing up and try to just smooth them out. So some occasions, if it is too noisy, it'll have a little bit difficulty, so you'll have to improve your samples a little bit more. But again, this is why we can have those different slots and we can test out different combos if our computer can handle it. So where is this? Is the main question of the day. I think it's under our view layer properties. So we're exploring all of these way icons today. So that third one where it's like a pile of pictures, view layer properties. We're going to check mark denoising data. And then we want to go into our compositing viewport and click use nodes. So it should have, when you click the use nodes button, it should have like a little, one of the, like, we're familiar seeing this with our material, but it should show like your render image. And actually, I want to make sure it's using my previous render. So I don't want it to use my good one. I want it to do one with the low samples just to show you guys. So I'm going to do a new render really quick. Okay, so I have my new render that's just at back at the one multiplier for my samples. Sorry, my cats are throwing a tantrum. They're very hungry. The one multiplier, I can't say that word, for transmission and subsurface, just so we can see the denoiser in action. So this is going to look a little bit noisier than my 8-minute one, but hopefully our denoiser will do the job. So, okay, that's the one we want. And what we're going to do is we're going to add in a denoiser filter. So do Shift A like we were doing with materials. Anything in the compositing screen would be like After Effects to like alter your final render. So if you want some more stylized effects, you can explore these settings. We're just going to cover the essential denoiser for this, but go into Filter, Denoise. Again, you can also search it, but Filter, Denoise, and you're going to notice there's 3 sections that say noise on my render layer. Noisy image connects to my denoise image. Denoising normal goes to normal. Denoising albedo goes to albedo. And then I need to connect this denoise to my composite. So it's kind of like just like connecting our render layer our picture to our actual like finished image. So let's open up our render. So you might be like, wait, you accidentally opened up your like higher samples one again, but this is our low samples one, dot free. Wahoo! So this will probably be the most effective way. I did want to show you guys how to do the samples itself though, because sometimes the denoiser, depending on how much noise there is, won't do as good of a job because it's like looking for edges to get rid of those dots. But this will hopefully allow you to keep a lower sample size to still get a pretty crisp image. One more thing, you might see like it looks a little pixelated, and that's just the resolution in combination with me zooming in and out. So if I had like this open at like a 1:1 scale, you can't really notice that. But if you were doing like a zoom shot of my bear or something, I would want to physically zoom in the camera and then re-render it. So just keep that in mind if you're like, why is it pixelated? Zoom in your actual camera instead of like zooming in your picture, your render picture. So that should be everything to give you guys your final render images. Once you're happy with it, you can save it. So if you go under image, and then you have all your save options, you can do save as, recording, render recording. Oh, I said render. And then you should have your nice JPEG. I like saving JPEGs. That you'll submit as your project.